Welcome everyone to the 17th webinar in the Governing for Reform in Aged Care webinar series. Today's webinar is around informed decision making for boards and leaders. My name is Nikki Doyle, KPMG Australia's National Sector Leader for Ageing, and it is my pleasure to be your host today. I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we are meeting upon today. Today I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to country. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending from other areas of Australia. Today's webinar is about how you and your governing body and executive team can take a shared responsibility to optimise clinical governance and ensure that your organisation continually delivers high quality care to older Australians. Ensuring robust clinical and corporate governance is vital for aged care providers. However, the interplay between them can be challenging, and ultimately governing body members need to understand both. The Royal Commission found that some boards and governing bodies lack professional knowledge about the delivery of aged care, including clinical expertise. There is a risk that they may focus on financial risks and performance without a commensurate focus on the quality and safety of care. There is a lack of accountability, particularly when things go wrong. And that's part of what we want to explore today. Recent reforms, including the requirement to have a governing body member with clinical expertise, have sought to address these issues. Whilst governing body members do not have to be clinical experts, all of them need to have enough understanding and knowledge to appraise the quality and safety of care that is being provided and take action to improve where required. Governing body members also need to ensure they have the skills and processes in place to be able to utilise the clinical expertise of colleagues around them, including clinical members of the governing body, quality care advisory committees and clinical staff. For today's webinar, I am delighted to be joined by Luke Grieve, Dr. Maria Founders and Associate Professor Craig Whitehead, all of whom I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to. And I'll introduce each of them more formally shortly. Before we get started, I'm conscious that while many of you joining us today have been participating in Governing for Reform in Aged Care for some time, others are new to the program and may be wondering what Governing for Reform in Aged Care is all about. If you're here for the first time, welcome to the program. As a registered program participant, if you head to the Governing for Reform in Aged Care website, you'll have access to a range of what we call GFR resources. Some of the resources that you might like to access that are linked directly to today's webinar include the online learning module around clinical governance, a toolkit chapter around quality in aged care, podcast looking at bringing the clinical into the boardroom by Kathy Boulding, and also our previous webinar on improving clinical governance culture. You'll also find recordings from all of our previous webinars and information about opportunities to get involved in other parts of the program. Before we start our panel discussion today, I would like to draw your attention to the layout of the screen. You will notice that you can manipulate the screen in any way that you like. So if you would like to see the presenters in full screen, you can expand the various windows to suit your preference. We're also really keen to make this an engaging discussion. So if you would like to submit a question to the panel, please do so in the question and answers box on your screen. We will aim to leave time at the end of today's webinar to select some questions to actually ask the panel members from the audience today. So I would like to introduce the panel that we have today, and it's an absolute pleasure to have these three guests joining me, particularly on this important issue of clinical governance for non-clinicians. So please join me in welcoming our panellists today. First up, Luke Grieve. So Luke is a purpose-led and compassionate leader who thrives on the complexity and diversity of operating in the fast-changing corporate and economic environment in health and ageing. Throughout a very broad and practical career in aged care, Luke has worked across the complete service continuum from low-level community care, short-term restorative care, transition care, acute home care, and then at the other end of the spectrum through to retirement living, residential aged care, and subacute hospital care. To develop the technical depth required of a subject matter expert, Luke has worked through all functional areas of aged care service delivery and has a good understanding about how technology assists in supporting a shared approach to clinical governance for non-clinicians. In his 30 years plus of operational experience within health and ageing, he has demonstrated his leadership of people and organisations through the transformation from reactive care-focused business models through to automated, digitally enabled models designed to deliver proactive, wellness-focused customer outcomes. Welcome, Luke. Our second guest is Dr. Maria Founders. So Maria is a non-executive director at the Bethany Group in Western Australia. She is a medical graduate of the University of Western Australia, a fellow of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, and a consultant geriatrician at St John of God Hospital in Midland. She is also a member of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Geriatric Medicine and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Maria has extensive experience as a clinician in aged care and is actively involved in a wide range of clinical governance activities. Maria holds academic position at the University of Notre Dame in Fremantle as discipline lead for geriatric medicine, and she is also chair of the Services Review Committee and a member of the Experience Committee. Maria has completed a Masters of Public Health and is also currently undertaking a Master of Bioethics at the University of Sydney. Maria is deeply committed to ensuring continuous safety and quality improvement across the aged care sector. She is passionate about embedding best practice, evidence-based clinical care standards and enriching the ageing experience for older Australians. Welcome, Maria. Looking forward to your contribution to our discussion today. And our last panellist is Associate Professor Craig Whitehead. So Craig has been a member of the board at Helping Hand since January 2008. Craig is an active geriatrician and clinical manager, and he's been the Regional Clinical Director of Rehabilitation, Aged and Palliative Care in the Southern Adelaide Local Health Network since 2009 and sits on their executive. Craig is responsible for the clinical streams of aged care, rehabilitation, stroke medicine, palliative care, allied health, and directs multidisciplinary teams providing inpatient, outpatient, and outreach services to older people in Southern Adelaide. He also has regional responsibilities for the implementation of the State Health Care Plan for Aged Care in South Australia. Craig has over 80 publications and is active in research that seeks to understand the health challenges faced by older Australians within the aged care system. A very big welcome to Craig. So, for today's topic, we are exploring clinical governance for non-clinicians and the importance of a shared approach across all governing body members as well as senior executives. This is such an important topic, and we've heard what the Royal Commission had to say about some of these challenges. And it's an evolving area, and certainly some of the reforms are looking at how to address this. But certainly having a clinician who may sit on your board is potentially only part of the answer, and hence our discussion today. So my first question, and I'm keen to actually hear about this from each of our panelists as a starting point, is about what is your perspective on why clinical governance is actually important for all governing body members? Maria, I might come to you first and then over to Luke and Craig.
All right, thanks, Nikki. I'm very grateful to be here. So my view on this is good clinical governance is really part of good corporate governance. So I don't think we can really dissociate the two. And really, when you're, having joined an aged care board as a clinician, we're really in the business of delivering sort of safe, good quality care, and that sort of, really, there's a financial impact to that as well, of not delivering safe and good quality care. So that which impacts on all board members. And we have a legislative requirement as well. The Aged Care Act and the Charter of Aged Care Rights. There are responsibilities that come with that. And then really just, the ethics. I think, we're looking after frail, vulnerable people, and I think as governing board members, we have an ethical obligation to deliver the safest, best quality care overall. So there's sort of, some initial thoughts probably to get the ball rolling.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maria. Luke, interested in your thoughts?
Yeah, couldn't agree more about the ethical responsibilities of a board member. And I think I come back to also what is clinical governance as fits within a corporate governance framework. And a lot of people say that, clinical governance is really just corporate governance in a healthcare or clinical setting. So therefore, trying to separate your responsibilities from governing finance or risk or people issues away from clinical issues is very hard to do. In the past, I think some people may have acquitted responsibility through a specific member of the team, somebody who has had that focus and who can provide the governance assurance. But more and more, we get wider examples. We've got more complexity of care. We've got more responsibility for openness and transparency than I think has ever been there before. And again, there is the legal requirement and obviously directors' responsibilities for assuring the board of good, strong governance and being across some of the clinical areas, which are fundamental to 3/4 of the operation of the business, is an imperative.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. Was keen to pick up, and Craig, I might come to you for this question. Luke mentioned about in the past, often the responsibility sat with a single person around clinical governance. Craig, what are your thoughts? Why should clinical governance not just rest with clinicians?
Well, the reality, I think my colleagues have said it. The reality is, and this goes both health and aged care, is that good, safe clinical care is highly efficient care, is most cost effective. If you want to build good infrastructure, that infrastructure has to be informed by the clinical situation you're dealing with. And I think, I think you can't separate good clinical from financials and the rest, as my colleagues have said. I think that's fundamentally the case. I think one of the real challenge for boards is that you probably couldn't find a higher risk population from a clinical governance point of view. There are a lot of adverse events that occur in aged care, not all of which are modifiable. You can manage risk for a lot of these things, and I think so. I do think there is a clear role for people who can understand, can risk assess things because they've got that clinical background. But I don't think you could have an executive director who didn't at least feel a little bit worried about those clinical risks and say it's all the nurse's job, or it's all it's not my responsibility. At the end of the day, you can't make good non-clinical decisions like around infrastructure or whatever without actually understanding the clinical risk that you're going to take on board and know how you can mitigate that. And reputational risk for an organisation will drive as much, if not almost completely, on your clinical outcomes. If you have a catastrophic clinical outcome, you're going to be in the newspapers, and that's going to be a problem for everyone on the board. So I think, we've seen in the recent history before the Royal Commission, from South Australia, we were where Oakden occurred, which is one of the drivers for that. That was a catastrophic clinical outcome, and that was a complete failure of clinicalness. And that particular institutional bit, the state run, was also financially a disaster area. So I think you can't separate them, I think is my view.
Fantastic. Thanks for those insights. I'm keen, Maria, to hear from you. What do you think are some of the main challenges and barriers for leaders being able to understand the interplay between robust clinical and corporate governance in aged care?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So I think there's a lot of legacy, I think, in this space. So, the clinic, as in the past, I think the clinical bits were always done by somebody else. So there was always a sort of almost an abrogation of responsibility. And you've talked about, why clinical governance shouldn't just sit with responsibility. But, more and more, there's an understanding and a recognition now that the governing body has responsibility beyond sort of finance and risk. I think some of the challenges is the language of clinical care is unfamiliar. So the language that I speak as a clinician is unfamiliar language to my board peers. So understanding different roles that the workforce have within the organisation, what they do. So I think the clinical language of pressure injuries and falls and restrictive practices. This is not common language for most people on a day-to-day. So I think there's it's stepping into an unfamiliar space for governing members who don't speak the language. So it takes a bit of courage, I think, to walk into somewhere that you don't quite understand. So from a board point of view, I think that it is challenging to take that responsibility on. But as I give an analogy, like when I did the company directors course, they opened my eyes to my financial risks under the Corporations Act, and these were things that I didn't know about. So I think the same analogy applies to clinical care. So I think we all, as governing members, have a responsibility to step into spaces that we're not comfortable with and we're not familiar with, and to learn. So we have an obligation to learn about things that we don't know much about. So I think there are challenges and there are barriers, and clinical care is a space that people feel that they don't know too much about. So that it's a language they don't speak. So, but avoidance isn't the answer. I think you just have to step in and ask questions as. And the same approach I took towards areas that, I wasn't expert in. I didn't, my financial literacy, my understanding of risk management, strategy. So these were things that I've had to learn about as a board member. And by the same token, my fellow board members have stepped into the clinical space and are asking clinical questions now.
Fantastic. Look, I'm interested in your perspectives. Maria's given some great perspectives from a governing body member. Is this any different for executive leaders?
No, I think it's in the separation of responsibilities, Nikki, where senior executives really need to present the data and information for the board to mitigate their responsibility of governance across that data and information. And some of the hardest challenges for a board are understanding what information do I need to be across, and then how is that information presented to me. So if you can present falls as a EBITDA and pressure injuries as a PRPA and wounds as an MPT, there's board members who will get transferability and understanding of, I'm looking at a set of statistics, I'm looking at a set of information and I understand it, I can interpret it and I can govern it. And the other information that we look at from a clinical perspective, albeit there is some acronymical and some wording differences, it can still be presented in a manner to which a board member can absolutely assuage their responsibilities of governing. So not differently for a senior leader. If I was a senior leader without a clinical background, I'm still required to be across the clinical information that's going on. And it's incumbent upon the senior leadership team and the executive leadership team to present the information to a board in a way that they can digest, interpret, and govern successfully. And that openness and transparency creates that atmosphere to present the material so that people can understand it. And I would come back to a question earlier that it isn't best resting with clinicians, because it's actually the illogical questions asked by someone who's not a clinician who can actually pick up some things that are going on. We in the clinical world would probably assume that there's a certain amount of injuries that occur due to clinical practice, and therefore we would normalise that. Whereas a board member who's from an accounting or finance or human resource background might ask the right illogical question, which is, why did that occur and how can we prevent it from occurring again?
So in actual fact, the curious questions, which I think are often termed as, this may be a little bit of a dumb question, but can I ask, are actually really important then.
Yes, absolutely. Some of the best directors I've had come from fast-moving consumer backgrounds and things like that, nowhere near healthcare, and they ask the most penetrating questions, because it's a question of why is that presenting itself like that, and what do we need to do about it if we need to do something. Whereas, as I said, sometimes for clinicians, we can normalise something to, in the industry, it's accepted to have 1.7% pressure injuries across a population of 1,000 operating bed days. Whereas another director might say, well, is that really the best we can do? Could we get that down to a 0.025% pressure injuries across our 1,000 operating bed days? And a clinician might not ask that question because they might tolerate the benchmark as being an industry accepted norm, whereas someone outside of that question set would ask, as you said, rightly, so I think this is a dumb question, but it's actually not. It's the curious question which creates great governance. Yeah.
Fantastic. Some great insights, and hopefully that gives all governing body members some confidence to ask some of those questions, even if they think it may seem obvious to other people around the table. We've actually already got a great audience question, which I think is actually quite pertinent for our discussion now. So, Maria, I might just come to you for this one. But the question is, and I am going to just amend it slightly so that it to make it hopefully make some sense. But it's really around people that are experienced board members, and you talked a little bit about this, but are now involved as members of a governing body for small private providers. And I think it's really about, the question is really about, well, where do you go and where do you start? So how do you go on this journey of actually starting to understand clinical and ask the right questions, ask the curious questions, and starting to feel confident about it? So Maria, keen to get your thoughts, and then Craig, I might get you to add in your thoughts as well after that.
Yeah, so I'll start with probably just an echo from what Craig has said about the best questions that have actually come to me from the non-clinicians that have stopped me in, made me think about something with a different lens, because you can sometimes actually be impeded to a certain extent by having that clinical lens, because your threshold of tolerance for example, clinical incidents is relatively low, because we see it all the time. So I think that, that point of actually having, there's no question that's too silly. There's no, and I've learned so much from the questions that have actually come to me from non-clinician board members that have actually stopped me and made me think about things in a completely different way, and and look at it from a board perspective rather than a clinical perspective. So coming to kind of the question about sort of, thinking about sort of being a small private provider, it's remaining curious and asking questions, and making sure that you've got a good and transparent, open relationship with your executive team, making sure you've got the clinical governance framework in place that you are confident with. And it's always about, the probing questions, being curious, and having a robust clinical governance framework that you have confidence in that is delivering. And I think, the idea of being able to, look at information and benchmark to peers. So, how do we work, and what do our clinical governance standards look like relative to other providers? How are we functioning? Are we delivering best practice? So I think it's always just asking questions and remaining open and keeping that channel of communication and being transparent. Transparency is key. The board needs to know certain things, and delivering that information, up to the board is important. So, I hope that's answered the question. So it might be a little bit vague.
No, I think that's a great start. Craig, can I get your thoughts and additions around that?
Sure. I strongly endorse what's been said, the question, because I think you've got to ask those questions as non-clinicians, because it is all, and as they are, tolerance of risk is much higher than, in fact, tolerance risk in healthcare is way higher than you'd find in non-healthcare businesses. We tolerate enormous levels of risk, and I think that may not be good for healthcare, but that is the practical reality of the world we live in. Look, I think there's two issues. I think I really feel, if you're a non-clinician, you've got to go to the things and getting data that you can understand and report it and present it in a digestible format is really important. And I think there are challenges with that, because a lot of organisations, I think if you're talking to your organisation and they can't produce data about adverse events or what's going on, well, that's a clear line in the sand. They've got to be able to tell you what's going on. I think the other thing that's really, and one of the limitations of data is really the benchmarking for aged care providers, so that you can actually know whether you're outside of, you're an outlier in terms of your adverse events, is really quite problematic in Australia. It's actually quite difficult to get that information, and I'm not sure that was one of the lost opportunities, I think, from the Royal Commission, is that they could have made stronger recommendations, or government. I can't remember if they did make a recommendation about it, getting out benchmarking for aged care providers so that you can all know, this is how we do things, this is how things have improved in healthcare, is by being able to benchmark with other like providers. The other area, I think, is to really strongly encourage hearing the disaster stories, because every adverse event is an opportunity to learn. And I think if you've got an organisation that will tell the board about something that's gone wrong, tell them about their actions, and you will learn a lot. I mean, you'll know, if you're a non-clinician, that if you've got a problem in an organisation, the response to that, you get a sense for whether that response to it is genuine and appropriate. What you should be very, very concerned if you're not any bad news stories. I feel very reassured that when the staff at Helping Hand tell us about something that's gone wrong and then tell us how they fixed it and what the actions they put in place. That's because clinical governance isn't about it all being tickety-boo all the time. It's about monitoring, recognising where there's a problem, striving for improvement. And there's always going to be things go wrong. What you want to know is you've got a robust framework for things to improve. And I think if you had an organisation that was just consistently telling you it's all great, I think you'd be very concerned as a board director and start to ask more penetrating questions, because you really need to be here about, perhaps perversely, but you do need to be about hearing about things that aren't going well and the reaction chain, because then you know that you've got a framework in place that's actually picking up the adverse events.
Fantastic. Thank you, Craig. Just as a bit of a follow-on question, one of the things you talked about was reporting. We've just had a question come in about, and this is in relation to home care, about an organisation who are providing clinical indicator reports to their governing body. And the question is about, what useful information and indicators should be included in the report to help the governing body to monitor clinical performance? Have you got any suggestions?
Gosh, that's a very, very big question. Just to take an overarch. I think, to put my science hat on for a moment, I think there is an enormous science around indicators, and unfortunately, I don't know that the Commonwealth has embraced that science and actually developing really robust, meaningful clinical indicators, because there is quite a science behind it. Having said all of that, from a home care perspective, I think things that are, clearly things that are less relevant, like falls and falls-related events, which do get reported, are obviously less relevant. I think, to be honest, in home care, issues around medication and how you're managing medication are probably a key performance indicator for a home care provider. And then there's going to be, I think it's something that you could look at. Now, how much as a home care provider are you going to be able to influence things like hospitalisations and some of those other adverse events? So I try to focus on what's actually within the remit of your team or your staff that are going in to help. And obviously, if someone has an injury whilst a staff member is there, that's a key event that you'd want to know about. And I think that's probably the other thing. You'd want to hear people presenting key adverse events, so high risk adverse events that have occurred. You want to have them clearly reported up, and knowing that they've happened and knowing what the response is. Not that it's a problem that they've happened, obviously it's poor for the individual, but knowing that there's been a response. That's what probably is more important than anything, is knowing that if an adverse event occurs, it's dealt with. In terms of routine indicators, I think probably medication for home cares, probably medication adverse events is probably the one over which providers have the greatest control. I think the suite of indicators that's developed for home care that's similar to residential aged care, I'm not sure is entirely fit for purpose. I think if you were going to, I think you would design a completely different set of indicators if you really wanted to drive a different outcome for home care around, patient independence, people's ability to do things for themselves, about that kind of rehabilitative or restorative type model. And I don't know that the Commonwealth is necessarily thinking in that way. But to be honest, I'm not sure that the set of indicators and data we collect now for home care really fit for purpose for what you'd want a home care system to be.
Okay. Luke, I was really keen to come to you and find out how and this is an audience question as well, so please keep the questions coming in. How do you balance the best clinical practices with pragmatic implementation on the floor? And this is particularly timely because the second part of the question is, when the workforce is notoriously time poor and very task orientated. So keen to get your thoughts on that, please.
Probably one of the most challenging areas for aged care in Australia at the moment, with all of the reform and the requirements for reporting and the regulations and the collection of data, which absolutely distracts from the primary events of making and taking care. So if I had more time to do that, I probably wouldn't need to report on the issues that are started because people are not focused on the care activity. So it's always an ongoing balance on how much documentation, how much reporting is required to be met legislatively, how much more do I need to add to good corporate and clinical governance to give a rounding out. And again, I'd suggest that there's a standard suite of indicators that we use to develop themology and theme-based approaches across the area. And then trying to digitise and automate as much of that as you possibly can for your frontline teams, because you don't want them spending hours and minutes and days pushing bits of paper around and creating manual effort when we really want them focused on delivering frontline care. But I think it's something that aged care operators, aged care providers, home care providers have struggled with for ad nauseum, and is something we will continue to sort of work on, creating the most operationally efficient mechanisms of meeting both your legislative reform, but also an escalation and reporting framework of information for governance.
Fantastic. Thank you, Luke. I've also got, this is going to just take us back a little bit. There's a couple of people that are querying and wanting to know about some of the acronyms you used in your previous answer, including, I think, MPT. So I'm not sure whether you can remember back, but just wondering if you can provide us any insight around that.
I think there'd be a finance expert online that will tell us what net present value, NPV, net present value is. I'm sure. I think one of the things that was raised earlier by the panel was acronyms in our industry are significant and large, and they do create complexity fog for board directors, which means, you know, you're looking at something and you're unsure what does that actually stand for. There's some very good tools and resources out there on explaining those acronyms, but yes, just NPV. Sorry.
Fantastic. I think that's an excellent point, Luke, because I think that actually applies both for the clinicians and also the non-clinicians, because certainly aged care itself has a lot of acronyms, a lot of abbreviations. Likewise, so does the clinical world, but also so does the governance world as well. And you put all three of those together, it can be incredibly confusing for people coming in. So I think that's just a reminder for all of us to, number one, not be afraid to ask curious questions, even around what different things mean. But likewise, for all of us that are already existing, to really take the time to not use shorthand and to really try and explain what different terms might mean. Another one, I just really keen, we've got a great audience question here. Maria, I might come to you first and then Luke, get your perspective. It is about, well, given the conversation, given what we've been talking about, and given how important the clinical component is, how necessary is it for the CEO of an aged care provider to have clinical experience or qualifications? So Maria, interested in your viewpoint around this. And then Luke, I'll come to you to see what your thoughts are.
Thanks, Nikki, because that is a really good question, isn't it? And I think when we, you know, and I think we draw back to what we're talking about today. And I think at the end of the day, you know, clinical governance being part of corporate governance. So a CEO needs to have skills in, you know, of an aged care organisation, has skills in lots of different areas. So, you know, the financial literacy skills, you know, understanding of risk, understanding of strategy, understanding of clinical governance. So I think, you know, I think if we pair it back to, you know, what do we want from, you know, a CEO, we want to have skills in all these different areas. So, and you know, there are advantages and disadvantages to having that clinical lens. And sometimes that lens can be disadvantageous. Sometimes it can be advantageous. So I think, you know, in terms of my, and I, you know, I'm really offering my own personal opinion. I think, you know, the CEO needs to be multifaceted and have skills and knowledge in lots of different areas. They don't, you know, in terms of clinical expertise, surrounding yourself with clinical expertise in your subcommittees, in your clinical governance team, you know, who can feed the right information up to the CEO and then up to the board, I think is, you know, is the skills that you require. So personally, I think it's I don't think that a CEO needs to be a clinician.
No, is that very much that well-rounded shared responsibility and drawing on a variety of different skills and strengths of different people coming through to support the CEO is what I am hearing.
Yeah, and I think that's that's an important part of the the organisational structure, rather than being a skill set that is specific to the CEO. Others may disagree with me, but I think we've established already that clinical governance is part of good corporate governance, and the other facets of of being an executive leader require that expertise in lots of different areas, including clinical knowledge.
Fantastic. Luke, I'm interested in your insights on this.
Look, I would completely agree with Maria. I wouldn't ask me to cannulate anybody anymore these days. Maybe a small wound dressing I might be helpful with, but it can narrow the focus of the CEO. We're more content experts, which means we focus on things that, again, are somewhat familiar. Whereas I think if I use my own example, I need to be drawn around colleagues that are talking about corporate structures, talking about investments, talking about liquidity management, talking about taxation, all things that are part of a corporate governance framework. So I am just a member of the team. I lend my skills and my experience and my background to where, my strengths are best utilised for the organisation. But overall, I'm still required as a senior leader and a director to have that balance. You can't just have a single focus on how you approach it. So I think there is a blend. It can sometimes be your greatest possession, but it can sometimes also be your greatest evil, because it's making you focus really heavy on content and not really elevating up sometimes to a strategic level. So yeah, there's boons and banes, I think.
Fantastic. So I think we've heard really clearly that I think there are potentially some positives, but also some pitfalls and things to think about, and that it is potentially one of many skill sets that are required, but likewise it doesn't necessarily have to sit within an individual person, and that potentially that shared ability to bring a range of different skills, there is strength in that as well. Luke, I might stay with you. From your perspective, looking at executive leaders, how does it play out? Have you got an example about what happens when you actually see that successful integration of corporate and clinical governance?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think when you create an environment where there's an openness and transparency of escalation of critical issue, when a joined leadership team will join together and sort of manage an event, and critical events have a tendency to bring that together. So if an event is escalated up through a senior leadership team into a board would meet with the senior leadership team, executive leadership team, and then they're all adding the value of their backgrounds and experiences. You may have lawyers on your board of directors, and they will offer you a legal risk element. They will offer you a legal framework and legal governance. You would have people that are more aware of the media, communications sort of background, so they would lend that lens to that risk and give you, different approaches from that perspective. You would have definitely people and culture or HR board directors who give you absolutely how are we focusing on the people, where are the people, what debriefs have been done. So yeah, over my career, I've had really great examples of where an issue has been raised from the front line through an open and transparent escalations and reporting framework. A senior leadership executive team brings that to a board, and a board is heavily involved in supporting the CEO and the leadership team in how they actually address that particular adverse event. And that really then demonstrates that integrated framework of clinical and corporate all together in one, working. And it's one of the things that I would say to everybody, the more you can do that as a board and a senior leadership team of working together, of understanding and exploring these issues together, the more familiar you'll get, the more trust that will be gained, and therefore freeing up, one of the biggest elements of any governance framework being openness and transparency.
Fantastic. Thank you, Luke. Craig, I might come to you next. Obviously we have got regulation that is coming that requires governing bodies to have a clinician on the board. Are there any pitfalls or things that boards and governing bodies need to be aware of in terms of bringing a clinician on board? So interested in your viewpoints as a long-standing board member or clinician and board member at Helping Hand.
It's a great question. Look, I think that one of the challenges is going to be is because the reality is most clinicians are clinicians and have very few governance skills. I mean, there are a small number who've done AICD courses or have AICD qualifications, and there's a number who would have management positions who've done formal management training. So, been fortunate. I mean, in fairness, probably learned a lot about corporate governance by being on the board. I don't think I came in with that level of experience, I'll be completely honest. And I think that's one of the challenges of engaging a clinician who isn't at that point in their career where they're willing to learn that skill set and learn actually that being a board of director, being on a board, an executive director on a board is different from, I don't know, running your team in the hospital. And to be honest, I suspect those skills in senior clinicians are not widespread. You need to look fairly. To be honest, there's quite a lot of those skills, particularly in the nursing community rather than in the medical community. It's probably more prevalent in that group, I would say. Obviously, specialists like myself who spend a lot of time, caring for people from residential aged care and research in that area. I mean, we bring a very unique perspective, but there's not a lot of people who do that either. So I think that's the real challenge is particularly, everyone's going to want someone, and it's not as if experts in aged care, both at a nursing and medical level, actually are that widespread. I think the issue will be trying to target people who give you that perspective that's real and current, as well as being able to deal with the different role of being a director, where it's more about assurance and strategy rather than just getting in boots and all and getting absorbed into the detail. Because that's certainly one of the challenges I found, I think, when I first started is, I would dive very much into operational detail, which is not really what you absolutely want from a board director. Where I'm asked to give an opinion on it, sure, we'll do that. But it's trying to keep that level a bit higher. So I think that's the real challenge, is that actually the skill set in the clinicians that you need to operate effectively in that board level may not actually be that prevalent, and be a clinician at the same time.
Fantastic. And do you think there's any risk for the board as a whole in terms of bringing a clinician on board and feeling the clinical governance is covered off?
I think there are risks it's like choosing any board director. I think you've got to do your due diligence and do some research on it. The problem being that for a lot of senior clinicians like myself, we don't necessarily delve into those kind of channels where board directors are usually recruited from. And I think, you've use networks and to try and the right people. Now, that'll all be often quite local, and that's fine. But I think you've just really got to look carefully at what their mix of skills and CVs, and like you would select any other board member. I think there would be a risk in the same way that I can't easily judge between accountants and lawyers. There's probably risk in trying to judge between clinicians when you don't know the space. And I think you just would need to have due diligence. And, if you've got a CEO and other senior members who've got networks in their local area, they'll get a sense for who's the right person to ask. But I think there is a real risk that there's only going to be a small number of people who probably have the right mix of skills to really do this well. And I think problem is that you might get the wrong person on, and they'll say to you, "Yeah, it's all okay," but if they don't have the right mix of being a good, a clinical grounding and some of those more managerial governance skills, that's one of the real challenges, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you. Maria, we've got another audience question, which I was really keen to get your viewpoint on. The question is, do you see the value of having a board clinical governance committee or subcommittee who review and report the organisation results to the board as a whole, or should this deeper review be performed by the board itself?
So we at Bethany Group, we have a services review committee, which is a board subcommittee. That board subcommittee has responsibilities for clinical governance activities and does the deeper dive. So we have the capacity in our organisation, obviously for a smaller provider that may not be as feasible. And I'm recently become the chair of that services review committee, and I think that for me it's an opportunity to actually look at what do we report to the board, like what does the board need to know, and how can we consolidate the information that's coming out of this subcommittee into digestible format for the wider board, that they have the reassurance, provided to the wider board that the clinical governance framework is robust enough, so that the board is assured. So we function with a board subcommittee taking on this role, which allows that deeper dive. I don't think there's capacity within the kind of wider board format to really give some of those issues the attention that they deserve. So I think if the organisation has sufficient scale and resources in order to have a board subcommittee, for us, I think that works exceptionally well.
Fantastic. And Craig, just interested in your insights and how things work for you at Helping Hand, or thoughts around that in particular, in terms of having a clinical governance subcommittee versus the whole board.
Oh, look, I think it's a bit about the size of the organisation. Has been said. We have a client committee that I chat where the data is digested before going to board. We have quite a number of, so any of our subcommittees board members can attend. And interestingly, the client care committee, a lot of board members come along to, even though they're not formally appointed to it. And I think that's because of the anxieties they have about the risks that they're exposing themselves to. And I think they want to have that deep dive discussion. Now, not every board director does that, but some do. And so I think having a subcommittee is fine. To be honest, it's probably better in a way that you can actually have the more nuanced discussion and you can really explore the detail with management. And that makes the board processes easier, where you can, spend less time getting bogged down in that and more time focusing on strategy and other issues. So I think the board subcommittees serve a clear purpose, and I think it works very well. Having said that, if you're a small organisation of one facility or two facilities, you might not have the resourcing to do that, in which case I think the option there is not to not talk about it. I think it would have to be talked at a board level.
Fantastic. Thanks for those insights. Luke, coming to you, I'm interested in terms of looking forward. What are your perspectives on the challenges of tomorrow regarding clinical governance in aged care? And I know it's a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but really keen to get your thoughts.
Definitely the increasing complexity of the aged care sector, the regulatory burden, creating somewhat, some senses of burnout on people and clinicians, the reducing length of stay, and the increasing acute care nature of residents in aged care will mean that we're required to step change from a lower care environment to a much more higher care environment, shorter cycles of stay, meaning people are much more complex in the nature and technical nature of the care that they are needing to be provided. And absolutely, people are extending relationships with hospitals and doing hospital in the nursing home and things like that, where, again, you've got to have another layer of governance sort of involved in those processes. So I think some of those societal pressures and the pressures of the market as we move forward will create an environment where the governance does need to get much more closely aligned to tertiary. And therefore, there is elements of tertiary acute hospital-based care that, we haven't been subjected to for many years, that we certainly will as we move forward, which will create an impost for directors, again, to not just move into a sense of clinical reporting around a fall or a pressure injury. We will need to understand, hospital transfers and hospital discharges and timeliness of critical event management, root cause analysis, mortality review, and things like that.
Fantastic. Maria, interested in your thoughts on that topic. What are the perspectives of tomorrow?
Yeah, thank you. So actually, Luke, you've touched on a few things, because I've been thinking about this even prior to the webinar. So, the fundamentals are kind of, we've got funding challenges, we've got staffing challenges, but really, with my hospital clinician hat, we've also got sort of, where, the residential aid or the aged care sector is really just, it's a cog in a wheel, and a big wheel that turns, in the wider community. So, from hospital point of view, there's a lot of pressure on length of stay. There's pressure to push into sort of residential aged care. So we've got an older population with, with subacute care needs who are now entering a sector, residential aged care where they're, which is their home. So the demands on the staff and on the, to care for them in the community are increasing. We've got regulatory burden that you've already pointed out, reporting burdens that, that add, complexity to the workforce. And then, sort of the GP sector, which is the primary kind of, medical input into the residential aged care sector. That's got, staff shortages and some funding limitations. So I think, it's not all doom and gloom, but there are lots of challenges for tomorrow that, that all intersect with each other in quite a complex way. And I think, as an organisation, really, we've really got to be on top of it right from day one, and appreciate that those challenges are there and really try and sort of, work on each of those components. But there are challenges tomorrow, that are broad.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maria. Craig, I might come to you. I've got another audience question. It's a very practical based question. And I suspect the answer may be how long is a piece of string, but really the question is about how much time should the board be focusing on clinical governance items in comparison to other standard board agenda items? So interested if you have any thoughts around that.
Well, I'm a clinician, so obviously I think it's more important. But look, I think it depends where the organisation is up to. To be honest, I don't think there can be one size fits all. So if, for example, at a major adverse event, or you've had adverse events that have happened, or you've maybe had a recent review where you've had not met from your standards, then I think you've got to focus on making sure that the clinical care is good. Conversely, if you're going through an organisation where a merger with another organisation is being contemplated, or some form of property development, for one reason or another is the next stage, that's obviously got to take up some organisational time. I think, there's only so much bandwidth. If the structures are working well, however, you should be able to pivot from one to the other. So if you've got good clinical governance structure, they will bring the issues that are occurring, and you will be able, as I say, as a board director, you've got that assurance role. So you've got to be able to keep an eye on that and know that it's doing okay. And if you've got good clinical governance structures, you will know when there are things that will direct your attention to it. As I say, I think the worst thing would be if you, in fact, had to, you weren't getting any negative or any, you were just getting, it's all okay. I think that would be when I would be very a bit anxious about what's going on the floor. So I think the boards need to be agile enough to shift its attention to where the focus is. And for example, you've had problems where you've had the Quality and Safety Commission in, and they've said you've not done properly on. Well, the board needs to direct its attention to do that at that point in time. So I think it will change. It changes literally from year to year, and I think if you've got good structures of monitoring and reporting and a good culture of reporting of adverse events, then the board can be reassured that when a problem arises, it will know to turn its attention to that. I think that's probably the best way I would answer it. I think it depends where you are as an organisation at a particular time, to be honest. And I know when we've had time, we've had to shift our attention all the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great answer, and it was sort of along the lines of my, how long is a piece of string? Where do you go? But I think that concept that it's not a static point in time, and that you need to thinking about what your organisation is going through, what else is happening, and making sure that you actually, though it's not the bottom of the agenda each time, that it should morph and change, and there should be times where it's absolutely prioritised, and there are times where it may not need as much attention as some of the other things on the agenda, as I think a really good takeout. Craig, I might just stick with you, but we are fast getting to the end. So I'm really keen. I'm going to ask each of our panelists the same question. Just really keen for you, what are your 3 main actions for the audience to take away from today's session from your perspective?
I think the things I would encourage organisations to do is look at your data, see if you've got data that you can get reported regularly, so you've got some numbers coming through, and so you can get trending over time. I think for non-clinicians, I think they need to embrace their inner clinician and actually just start to ask questions about, and it doesn't matter how dumb they are, but ask questions about the things that go wrong in an aged care environment. I think we need those. We need, for people like me who's on a board, I need to be challenged about explaining why it's okay that people fall, and that's really, really important. Those are probably the big two. I'm going to go for two because I can't think of it at the top of my head, so I might let the others go.
Fantastic. I think two is perfectly fine. Luke, can I come to you next, please? You're hopefully three, but if two's okay, main actions that audience can take away after today's discussion.
Yeah, look, I come back to that, one of the original statements. Clinical governance is just corporate governance in a healthcare or clinical setting. You can't separate the two. They are unanimous. And again, the time that it takes to talk about clinical issues is the time that it takes. I would say review your current framework and audit its effectiveness. So really look at the framework you've got for escalations, for reporting, for information coming up. What governing groups do you have and how are they working? And really test their effectiveness. And it's not so bad for directors sometimes to get an example and lodge a test down below and have it see how it travels through their own system. And last one, seek input from others. There's 430 odd people on this line. No question is too stupid, and most people in the sector really are here to help. They really genuinely want great care outcomes for all of our elderly Australians. So I think, again, just reach out to people. There's always people who are keen to support each other.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. Maria, what are your three main actions for the audience, action items for audience members to take away today?
So pretty similar to what the others have said. So really governing members are just as responsible for clinical governance as they are for corporate governance. So be accountable, ask the questions about all the things that you need to know. Don't be afraid to step into unfamiliar space. So I did, I stepped into, a whole, as Craig's alluded to, a whole new world that I knew nothing about and have learnt. So be curious, learn new things and ask lots of questions. And as both Craig and Luke have said, there are no stupid questions. And in fact, the questions that are, that seem like, I'm not the expert here, but I'm asking this, are actually the best questions of all because they make you stop and think, as a clinician. And really probably just, know your business. And your business is actually, the delivery of safe, good quality aged care. And that involves having an understanding of, of clinical governance, and your staffing and your workforce that are delivering the care and the outcomes that are associated with that. So to be a good governing board member means knowing all facets of the business, and that includes, safe, good quality aged care.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all three of you. We are unfortunately at time, but there's been some absolutely fantastic insights from each of you on this topic. Certainly for me personally, I think some of the things that really stand out is, number one, that the clinical goes hand in hand in terms of being efficient. You need to think about clinical aspects around all sorts of decisions you need to make from a board, from accommodation through to financial decisions, workforce decisions. It is the centrepiece of decisions that boards need to make. I particularly like Craig's comment around challenging your clinicians on the board. So I hope each of you that are not a clinician on this call really take that to heart and go and ask those questions, the curious questions, the nonsensical questions, but also, and really dig deep and put your clinicians on the spot to help everyone on the board learn. And the other thing I think, which we touched on in the middle, was really about adverse events. And I think the comment around if you're not hearing bad news is actually, that's not a great thing. And really it's about how organisations learn and adapt and respond to adverse events, which is actually part of the, is really, really important. So that was some of my many, many takeouts from today. So thank you very much, Luke, Maria and Craig, for your input today and for a great discussion on a very, very topical area. Directly following today's event, we will be sending you an email with a link to provide feedback. Please take the time to do this, as it's really valuable for us to hear from you. We're trying to adjust the experience of governing for reform as we progress through these webinar events, and your feedback is critical for us being able to do this. Please also ensure you complete the diagnostic tool if you've not already done so. As mentioned earlier, please, some of the related learning activities will also be shared in the reminder email, and that includes the online learning module on clinical governance, the Quality and Aged Care Toolkit chapter, the fabulous podcast with Kathy Balding about bringing the clinical into the boardroom, and lastly, but certainly not least, the other webinar on clinical governance that we did last year on improving the clinical governance culture. Make sure that you join us for the next webinar on the 11th of October, which will focus on diversity of thought, a shared approach to leadership in aged care. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us today.